show you some of the boats that I've worked on over the years. And why is he in crutches? Well, it's been a hard life. No, I don't know. I was just saying 2 months ago I was walking 7 to 10 miles a day, but some mystery thing has happened to my body. But if you don't mind, I will stay on the crutches. It helps me to take the pressure off my leg, and it makes me feel much more authentic. And then if we have any problems, they can always be used as weapons. It's nice to have crutches because you get sympathy, and they can be used as weapons. So we're going to start story time with Captain Lee. So would you advance it, please? Now this is where I was born. Does anybody know what city that is?
St. Louis.
St. Louis. Okay, I was born under the... We didn't have a gateway arch when I was first born, but I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, my mom and dad took me down to the river, and my mom said, Lee, whatever you do, don't go out on that river, because you might drown, and that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you'll be entombed in the silt for an eternity, and your soul will be taken by the river. Well, maybe my soul was taken by the river. I was not a hero in any way, shape, or form in my younger years. I was not the quarterback on the football team, and I was not the valedictorian of my class. Now, there were some writers who came from Missouri. Has anybody heard of Mark Twain? Okay, so Mark Twain was from Hannibal, Missouri. There was another famous writer named T.S. Eliot. He's a poet. Anybody familiar with him? He wrote a poem called The Strong Brown God. It goes something like this. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. Patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, then as a problem confronting the builders of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities, ever, however, implacable, keeping its seasons and its rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget. So T.S. Eliot was so taken by the Mississippi River in St. Louis, where he was born, that he moved to England and never came back. There was another famous writer in St. Louis, and I'm sure you've all heard of Tennessee Williams, right? So I went to the same high school that Tennessee Williams did, only a few years later. First day of my English class when I was a freshman, our English teacher made a point to tell everybody that she gave Tennessee Williams a failing grade. Now, that's kind of like saying that you were Tom Brady's coach and you cut him when he was a freshman at your school. But she was very proud of having failed Tennessee Williams. Of course, Tennessee Williams wrote A Streetcar Named Desire, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but a very famous play that he wrote was called The Glass Menagerie. There was a young fellow by the name of Tom Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie. He came from a dysfunctional family in St. Louis, just like me. He wanted to leave to go to the Merchant Marines. I felt like the Mississippi River was right there for me. I didn't need to go to San Francisco. I could just go on the Mississippi. So I started calling. In those days, we used the yellow pages when we wanted to find a phone number. And I looked under river, and I got to this one subset that said towing companies. Now, when I use the expression towboat, does anybody know what that is? Has anybody seen barges on the Mississippi River around the Twin Cities? So the barges themselves, people ask me, I live in Lake City, people who walk by the river all the time will ask me, what's it like to live on a barge, Lee? Well, you don't live on the barge. The barges are hitchhikers. They're attached to a boat called a towboat, T-O-W. And the towboats push the barges up and down the river. I didn't know that at the time. I thought I was going to work on a tow truck on the Mississippi River. I had no idea how that was going to all come about. But can you advance it one, Rachel? Now this was the towboat that they put me on. Welcome to hard times. Okay? That boat was built in 1947. I got my dad to take me down to Riverview Boulevard in St. Louis to get on that boat called the Havana Zephyr. And when I got to the dock, there was two dock fellas there waiting to load barges, and they said, hey, what's going on, man? I said, I'm going to catch this boat. It's going to be here at 5 o'clock. That's the time they told me to be here. They just kind of chuckled and said, sit down with us, man. Smoke some cigarettes and we'll talk. Well, the boat didn't show up until about 6 hours later, and about halfway through that conversation, one of them turns to me and he says, hey, man, you got a girl? And I nodded my head, because I kind of did, and he said, well, after you're done that boat for 30 days, she ain't going to be waiting for your ass to get home. She's going to be gone. And believe it or not, he was right. For the next 11 years of my life, I didn't keep girlfriends very long. I guess they were just waiting for a chance to escape me, because I was escaping out on the river, work 30 days at a time on the towboat, get off. My first job as a deckhand, I made $25 a day working on that boat, mopping decks, slinging rigging around, jumping from one barge to another, which may be part of the reason I can barely walk anymore.
What year was that about?
What's that?
What year was that about?
That was 1972. When I got on that boat that night, I climbed down the ladder. There was a fellow about my age, and he looked at me and he said, what part of Breckinridge County you from? And I looked back at him very dumbfounded, because I had no idea in the world where Breckinridge County was. And he spit on the deck and said, damn. He said, you're an outlier. You're a stranger in a strange land, because every other deckhand on this boat's from Breckinridge or Meade County. They all got hired out of a beer joint, believe it or not. The beer joint was called Dead Horse Holler. Now they hired me out of St. Louis, I guess, because one of the deckhands might have gotten kicked off or fallen in the river. I don't know. They needed a deckhand pronto that night, and I happened to be handy. So they put me on the boat, and he leads me back into what's going to be my room. Well, he doesn't even knock on he doesn't even knock on the door. He just opens the door, and my roommate, who I'd never met before, his name was Bobby, is in bed in the upper bunk, and John turned the light on, and Bobby thought the whole state of Kentucky Commonwealth Highway Patrol was after him, and he jumped out of bed, landed on the deck, cut his foot, was sitting there bleeding, and he let out the most creative string of obscenities that I've ever heard in my life up until this day. And I thought, what have I gotten myself into? So I didn't sleep for the next 5 days, because I thought that the mission here was to kill Lee Hendrix. I expected at any moment that bulkhead of that boat to cave in, because we were putting barges together called Making Up Tow. They were going to cave in, and that boat was going to sink right there on the spot and put an inglorious end to my river career. Like I said, I didn't sleep for 5 days, but the first morning I met the chief engineer. Now the chief engineer is supposed to be back minding the engines, okay, minding the rudders and the engines. But what the chief engineer really loved to do was to sit in the galley and drink coffee with me. And he looked at me and he said, son, if you ever wear out a pair of boots on the deck of a towboat, it will be in your blood forever. And I thought, this is really sagacious and lyrical. Things are starting to pick up a little bit. And then he said, you're getting on in October. This was October 9th. He said, wintertime's coming. In the wintertime, that's what separates the men from the boys. If you can make it through a winter, it means one of two things. You're either tough enough or you're dumb enough to last. I can't tell by looking at you how tough you are, but you sure look like a dumbass. I think that you can make it through the winter. And that's been 52 years ago now, and here I am, still out on the river. Can you advance it one more? Now look, that's me on my first pilot's job. Now back in those days in the 1970s, there was no drug tests, which really came in handy for a lot of us. That was a lot of fun driving that boat up and down the river, and I was having a real good time. Can you advance it one more time? That boat was called the Charles Foss. I actually got promoted. By this time they did have drug tests, and this was the boat that I really loved when I was a towboat pilot, called the Ruth D. Jones. It was 5,600 horsepower. We ran up on this part of the river. We would push up to 25 barges with that boat, and later on I'm going to show you some videos of pilots taking 25 barges down the river and some of the things that can happen. So one more, please. Now, 1983. I've been on the river for 11 years. All my girlfriends were leaving me. There's not a word in the English language that will quite equate with the loneliness that you feel on a towboat pilot house at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's a nexus of fatigue, danger, and loneliness. And I was to the point where I needed to do something a little bit different. And I got married. I finally, when I quit the river. And a friend of mine and I, we decided that we were going to take people in canoes on the Mississippi River. And we got those 26-foot fiberglass canoes, and we'd go out and we'd take folks out. We'd camp on sandbars. We'd look for towboats. I'd explain to them, about the towboat business, and we really had a good time doing that. You couldn't make any money. So my wife comes up to me and says, "Are you having a good time out there in those canoes?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, we're not making any money. You got to do something to bring in a better paycheck." So advance it one more. So I, at this particular point in time, down in Iowa and Illinois and Missouri, the gaming industry had convinced the people in those states that it was much more moral to have a casino on a boat than it was any place else. Because now you've got mom, apple pie, and gambling. And there's just going to be a few slot machines over in the corner. But I could make a little bit of money doing that. This was an old steamboat called the President that had been converted to a diesel boat, and it was a gambling casino in the Quad Cities. Does anybody, you all know where the Quad Cities are. So that was one of the jobs that I had. I left that one to go over to a casino called the Empress over in on the Illinois River, in a very small river. The river was not much wider than it is from this wall over to that far wall over there. And one day we were out for a cruise. I was very early in my career there, and all of a sudden I hear, "Man overboard, man overboard." And they didn't respond real quickly. They said, "Oh, it's just a jumper." So what would happen was those people would get out on that gambling boat. We were out for a 2-hour cruise. They had lost all their money in the first 10 minutes. They didn't want to go for a boat ride. The best way for them to get to shore was to jump overboard and swim. And we had to go out. Now, you might think that this boy's up here telling you some lies, but no, this is the truth. It didn't happen every day. We would have to pull one out because it's our responsibility to go and rescue them. And I thought to myself, this job doesn't speak of longevity if they're actually jumping overboard to get off. So I decided that I was going to leave that industry and advance it, please. Oh, so then my friend Adrian Hargrove, he told me that I think you could come over here at the Delta Queen. Now this is in the pilot house of the Delta Queen. That's me when I was about 40 some odd years of age. That's Captain Garland Shoemaker, he was the captain of the boat, and he wrote a book called How to Become a River Pilot. And he thought that was just great fun to take a picture of me sitting behind the sticks of the Delta Queen, reading his book on how to become a river pilot. But that is actually in the pilot house of the Delta Queen. Has anybody here heard of the Delta Queen?
Yeah.
It was built in Scotland in pieces and shipped to the United States, put together in the 1920s. Finally made its way over to the Mississippi River. So advance it one more, please. But my main boat that I worked on, has anybody seen this one before? This is the American Queen, now bankrupt, just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm out of work. But that boat is that was the only overnight steamboat left on the Mississippi River. It's 400 feet long, 90 feet wide, and in 1996, I was honored with Captain Dick Carniff and I were the first pilots to bring the American Queen up to St. Paul. Back in those days, we actually came up to Lambert's Landing. We don't go to, we turn around in Redwood now. But that was the boat that I was on for a long time, and they went out of business 3 times while I was there in 15 years. And once again, my wife, a very practical lady, came up to me and said, you gotta go to work for somebody who doesn't go out of business quite so much. So the 3rd time they went out of business, I applied with, advance it please, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because they never go out of business. That is the motor vessel Mississippi. I went over there in 2009, retired from there in 2018. This is the motor vessel Mississippi right here. I became the captain of that boat in 2014. On the lower Mississippi River, concrete revetment is put into the river to keep the banks from washing away. The Corps of Engineers maintains the channel. And we also had trips where we would take the Mississippi River commissioners around to various ports, and they would have town hall meetings about the river.
Was that boat stationed in Memphis?
It was stationed, still is stationed in
Still is.
Memphis, yeah. I retired from there in 2000, actually retired up here at the St. Paul district on the dredge. But that was with the Corps of Engineers. Then I went to do what's called trip work, and one more time, please, Rachel. I was a river advisor on the Delta Mariner, now called the rocket ship. Rockets were loaded at Decatur, Alabama on the Tennessee River. I stayed on till we got down to Baton Rouge, and the ship went on around down the Mississippi around the Cape, Florida over to Cape Canaveral, but those were rockets that were loaded onto that ship. That stern opened up like a garage door, and those are some Delta and Atlas. Those are not nuclear warheads or anything, you know. They are. Okay, that's the last one of that. If you can go to, now we'll show you some action. We'll show you some towboat action here. Go to, how much time we got?
7:24. It's about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes? Okay.
Questions?
Yeah, let's go to the lock and dam, the first one. Yeah. Now, this is not how you want to go through a lock. You can see that right away. That you don't want to be in that particular. Can you start?
Is the tug separate there, just off on its own?
Yeah. I'll show you how it all happens. There you go. Oh, well, that's all right. We'll show you Vicksburg Bridge now. This is 25 loaded coal barges making the Vicksburg, Mississippi Bridge going down the river. This is going by a river called the Yazoo River in Vicksburg. And that's what it looks like when you're behind 25 loaded coal barges. Now this is all fast speed because you don't want to sit through all of this.
How wide are those individual barges?
Those barges are 35 feet wide. So they're 5 wide, so about 175 feet. and the tow's 5 lengths to about 1,000 feet up there.
Really?
What's the draft?
You know, it varies. I would say, you know, high water, you might have 10 or 11 feet of draft on the barges. Boats usually about 9.5, 10 feet, something like that.
The full water, those are 9 feet into the water?
Yeah, the barges, yeah.
Okay. And the boat itself? That's all.
It depends, you know, like I've worked on boats that are 8.5, I've worked on boats that are 10, you know. Depends on how much fuel you got.
Yeah.
Now notice the way, when he's holding on that's the span he's running right there. Look how he holds that right hand pier. Because he's got the faith that the current's going to take him off that pier. There's an old story about a towboat pilot who hit the Vicksburg Bridge and got fired. And I'm going to show you what happens when you hit the Vicksburg Bridge here in a minute. He got fired and he went home, and his wife was at home, and she said, "What are you doing at home? You're not supposed to be out making me some money." He said, "Well, I got fired." She said, "Well, what did they fire you for?" He said, "Well, I could tell you, but I'm going to show you." And he took her to the bluff overlooking the Vicksburg Bridge, and he said, "They fired me because I hit that damn bridge." And she looked, that span is 850 feet wide. And she said, "Well, I don't blame them." Anybody who could miss a hole that bridge that big, they ought to fire. But that's not counting for the set. So have you got the one there? Go to the next one after that. No, keep going. That one we just did. Can you go to the list of all of them? Go to Chad Progracki. No, right? Yeah, right there. So this is what happens when you don't hold the right hand pier enough. All of a sudden, it's 30 some odd barges taking their own independent flights down the river. And watch how fast that green barge shifts. Train me.
That's good.
Yeah. But this is not fun and games with this stuff, you know. I mean, if you miscalculate, or I don't know, I hate to see this happen to anybody because I've hit bridges before. Not quite this bad, but it could have been. And it's a very empty feeling. So now, this poor person, and it's probably a guy, I mean, there are women pilots, but mostly men. And now, you know, his whole month, his whole life has been altered, you know, because hopefully nobody got killed.
What about the leads that were holding them together?
The wires and the...
Yes.
Oh, let me show you. Go to another one here. 'Cause I'm glad you asked that question. Go to towing vessel collides with bridge. Yeah, right there. Try that. Now this is at night. This is down around New Orleans. This is called the Luling Bridge. This guy's flanking around this turn, which is supposed to be a safer maneuver, but this is unfortunately he overflanks. And I hate to be critical of anybody, you know, because the same thing that happened to me. But if you watch closely, what happens when these because it doesn't look good now, and he knows it. He's gonna put this searchlight on that bridge pier, and oh my, no, it's not gonna make it. There's no backing that up. You know, there's no stopping now. There's no brake pedal gonna stop that. Watch the sparks when it hits the bridge.
Well, there's reverse, you can try to slow down.
Well, you could try, but it ain't gonna. See all those sparks? That's all those wire cables breaking.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I just hate to see that happen sometimes. But and you know, I show this with mixed emotions just because I don't want you to think that towboat pilots are heroes as far as I'm concerned. I was one. But you know those guys are up there Anybody ever had a job where you only got 4.5 hours of sleep at a time? That you were on there for 30 days at a time and never got a day off for 30 days? That's what you face when you're up there. So fatigue, danger, and loneliness, they all come together, and sometimes so all those barges are floating down the river by themselves now.
Is there a difference in steering going against the current and with the current?
So generally speaking, they'll turn you loose going up the river quicker than they will. And I say turn you loose, they'll make you a pilot on your own going up the river because you can stop. But it's dangerous going up the river too. I'm going to show you now the worst of the bunch. Now, I will tell you that nobody gets killed. And you might find that hard to believe. Go to the last one, please. This is the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. Built in the 1870s by James Eads. Those arches on that bridge are heinous. Watch what happens.
Oh boy.
Hmm.
Ours is clear.
Who took that
Makes
picture?
me sick to look at that. Some guy on the bank. I got these all on YouTube. So, whoever was driving the boat apparently got out safely. You know, didn't. I guess he saw he was going to hit it and got out of the pilot house as quick as he could. Because now, you know, you got a boat that's not under control, and you got barges which look like they're chemical barges going down the river, kind of all by themselves. So this is no place to mess around out there, and it's fraught with peril from one day to the next. What's my time like? So, 15 more minutes? Okay, go back to the lock and dam, the very first one. Yeah. Uh-oh. So if you've lived up here, you may have seen locks and dams. They do have locks and dams. That's at the end of it. Just let it go and then start. Yeah, see, so this is called losing your ass.
Oh,
Okay?
right.
So you're supposed to go through that lock kind of this way. Your stern end's not supposed to be over there floating down sideways on the dam. But for some reason, the stern got away from him, and now all those 12 barges and his boat are floating sideways down on dam 11 there at the view. So now he's thinking, it's bad enough for those barges, but I don't want this boat to sink on that dam. So he's got to try to get that boat out of there. Calling his crew back, trying to get them to get the wires off of the boat. As those barges steady, he's getting so he does get the boat out. Okay, but watch what happens to this one barge over here. This is not the preferred way to go through that. Uh-oh. This is taken from the bluff of Eagle Point Park in Dubuque, right above Lock 11. But the poor old barge doesn't even make it all the way through. So that's all the cargo in there being exposed to the elements. Yeah. And now they got to try to get all those barges off the dam.
What happens in the situation that you were showing us before where the barges go everywhere and they're floating downstream? What's what happens next?
What happens next? So, generally speaking, you try to get 2 or 3 of them that are still together. And you get them and then you take them over to the bank someplace. And you find an area where the water's maybe not quite so fast. And then all those bridges, there was other smaller boats around there because those are harbors. And the river gets closed down, so any other boats that are around there are supposed to help gather the barges back and put them back. They don't go back together in an hour.
Yeah.
It's days, and some of those barges sank, so they're all the way to the bottom. We were at Grand Tower Chute down below St. Louis back in the 1970s when I was a mate, and we were helping another boat had run aground, and we were helping them pull their barges off the sand, and then we were building them back together on the side of the river. Well, not to get too technical with you, but instead of, we were putting the last barge in tow, instead of doing it the safe way, these cowboys decided to do it another wild way. And this barge came in and swung in and knocked all of them apart, all 15 of the barges that we had just been spending 2 days putting them back together, and they took off down the river. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and deck crew, even brave guys were running screaming for mama, and you know, the wolves were out chasing your ass. And I was lucky enough, I got on a barge that was attached to the towboat. But Jace Brown didn't. And that night in October, I think it was about 1975, he had an experience that probably nobody here has had. He floated for 15 miles down the Mississippi River in the early morning on a barge going down the river, and nobody knew that he was on it. He didn't even have a cell phone. He couldn't even call his girlfriend and tell her what a worldly guy she had. No, he was just one man, alone with his thoughts, running to the high side and praying God to forgive him for all of his sins. Well, actually another towboat did catch him a few hours later, and we didn't know what had happened to him because it was night. Nobody knew where Jace was. Well, the towboat brought him back to our boat, and he came back on, and he didn't say much of anything. His eyes spoke for him. It was the very last day Jace ever rode a towboat. He became a life insurance salesman in Poplar Bluff, and he had one hell of a story to tell for a deal. So that's what could happen. You could float down the river for a long way before somebody finally caught you. What normally happens is, if you're unfortunate enough to be the person who was at the sticks, when something like that happens, you get, because you're a basket case then, you don't want to, it's going to take you a while to get over that. So, they'll pull you off the boat and take you to the closest clinic, and they'll give you a little cup to pee in, make sure you weren't doing some drugs, and then they'll probably send you home and get another pilot on board, because you're not, you can only sleep 4 hours at a time in the best of times on a towboat. You're sure not going to be able to sleep for days after something like that happens. Some people, it's the end of their career if something like that happens. It's, just nightmarish kind of thing. But it could take several days to get all those barges put back together. Any other questions about anything? Yes?
Have conditions on the river changed over time?
Good question. So, you talking about conditions in terms of the channel itself?
Yeah, anything.
Okay, anything. All right, that's a broad field. But if you read Mark Twain, or you read about 19th century steamboats, about how the channel would change very whimsically from one day to the next, it doesn't happen anymore, hardly at all, because the Corps of Engineers, who I work for, doesn't let it. Put concrete, rock wing dams in to keep the banks from caving away. The channel is pretty steady from one year to the next. The wing dams pummel the water down through the channel. Locks and dams now have covered a lot of the wing dams up here, but in terms of the channel changing, it doesn't do it anymore. Now, towboats are fairly recent. The steamboats were the first boats to come up here. The first steamboat to make it up here was the Virginia in 1823, and most of the cargo then was loaded onto steamboats along with passengers. Those are called packet boats. There was also logs floated down the river from the Black and the St. Croix, and they were made together in these rafts, and steamboats would take them. It was a one-way journey down the river. You didn't take the logs back up the river. In terms of the towboats themselves, from the ones I worked on, they're bigger. The conditions are maybe a little bit, well, they're a lot more sanitary and clean. When I first started working on towboats in the 1970s, it was like being in a cowboy movie, more or less. As soon as we tied up in a town, off we went. And half of us might make it back, and half of us might not make it back. Now, you don't get off. If you get off and go to town now, they say take your suitcase with you and don't come back. So it's a lot more structured. You get paid a lot better. We used to have a cook on every boat. Now some towboats don't have cooks. Sometimes you're on your own with. I mean, they provide food, but you have to be the one to cook it. So that's a pretty broad. That's kind of a sketch of how things are different now. Yes, sir.
People still doing it as a career these days?
Oh, sure, yeah. People get on. When I first got on, I didn't know that I was going to do it for a career. I was really what I wanted to do was I had met a guy at a party, and he had said, "Yeah, I went to Europe," and I didn't have enough money to go to Europe. I said, "How'd you do that?" He said, "Well, I went out on a boat, and I worked for a month, and I didn't spend anything, and I saved up enough money, and then I could take my trip to Europe." Well, I made it 11 years on the boat, and I hadn't made it to Europe yet, and I finally did after 11 years, but I didn't. I thought I was going to be out there for one trip, but it takes a different kind of a person to actually go do that. You have to become accustomed to loneliness and desolation. You kind of have to almost be sort of a misanthrope, maybe a little bit. You got to be able to. You got to be able to handle loneliness, because that's really the main challenge, and not everybody can do that. It doesn't take any. Well, it takes skill, but you can learn those skills.
Did you have any difficulties with storms or anything on the river?
Storms can play havoc with you, yeah. When you got loaded barges, the wind doesn't bother you all that much, but empty barges, because they sit up high, or something like the American Queen that has very high profile, it catches a lot of wind. So anything more than a 20-25 mile an hour wind, you got to be crabbing up and down the river. I guess the most prolific storm I was ever part of was Hurricane Katrina. So in 2005, I was on the American Queen. We were in New Orleans on August 27th, and I went into town and walked around, and I was asking people what they were going to do for Hurricane Katrina, and they said, "We're just going to have a really big party." So they weren't really taking it that seriously. We got out of town on the American Queen. We went up to Natchez, and when the storm hit August 29th of 2005, the wind at Natchez was blowing 75 or 80 miles an hour. And of course in New Orleans it was complete devastation. And a lot of our crew had come from New Orleans. Some of them were unable to make contact with their families for up to a week. That was how devastating it was down there in Katrina.
But the American Queen got out of it pretty much by heading to Natchez.
We did, yeah. We still got a little way. I tell you what, when the wind's blowing 80 miles an hour and you go out and walk around, it will blow you back. a 175-pound man will have a hard time walking.
When you go out for 30 days at a time, like you were talking about, like what does that look like? What's the distance you're traveling? Where are you going, or
Well,
coming
that
back?
depends. It
Yeah.
depends on, so if you're on a steamboat, like the American Queen, we have a schedule that we keep, because we've got to be in St. Paul on such a, Red Wing on such and such a day, to run a tour, St. Louis on such and such a day. But on a towboat, it depends on how many barges you have, because the more barges you have, the slower you might go. Depends on where your barges are going, but I would say on a norm, if you were running from the Twin Cities down to St. Louis, it would take you about a week to get down there and a week to get back. And that's really rough, a rough estimate. Now, to give you an idea, if you left Lambert's Landing, where people here know where Lambert's Landing is, mile 839 on the upper Mississippi River. St. Louis is mile 180, so what is that, 600 and some odd miles? But if you go from St. Louis down to New Orleans, then you're talking about you're talking about a little bit more. You're talking about over 1,000 miles, because there's a lot more river down there in the lower Mississippi.
So it would be a month from St. Louis to New Orleans and back?
From St. Louis to New Orleans and back, it would probably be about 3 weeks. You'd
What
go
is
down the river pretty quick.
Yeah.
You go down the river, down on the lower, you go down the river pretty quick because you've got a good current. Up here, you don't have so much of a current. So your difference between going up and down on this river up here is not as drastic as it is down on the lower.
Now, why does the towboat push the barges instead of pulling them?
That's such a good question. People always ask me that. Why do you call it a towboat? You're pushing the barges, okay?
If you're driving with a trailer or something, you would never push it.
Well, if you were in a canoe, you would steer from the stern, right?
Right.
So it's the same principle. You've got better control from the stern than you do from up in the bow. Now, the first towboats didn't do that. They actually carried the barges along the side because they hadn't quite figured all this out yet. And those barges, when they would steer them, they would swing back and forth and they'd bump into the boat. It was a very obnoxious way to tow barges. And the first towboats, the first boats that did that were in the 1840s, and it wasn't until about 1900 that they figured out that it's a lot better to steer from the stern. Yes?
Did your cargo change over time? I noticed a lot of coal in the videos, so I was curious kind of what was in the barges.
That depends. So there's not quite so much coal as there used to be. Coal's kind of fallen out of favor in the United States. There's still a good amount of grain. There's a lot of petroleum. There's rock. When I first started running up here, we would bring coal up the river from the Ohio River to some of the power plants. The coal would get emptied, and then the empty barges would then be loaded with grain, and the grain would be taken down. So you had that whole industry there. There's cement. There's all kinds of stuff. Well, folks, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And if we're going to do some book signing,
Grab some books.
we can do that.
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to come out here and listen to it. And about 50% of it was true. So Riverman